بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Brothers and sisters and friends, and welcome to the Mirage of Atheism. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that every single one of you are in good health, have high iman, and that you and your families and your friends are well, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is enveloping you in His boundless love and His boundless mercy. So we're going to spend a few hours together talking about the Mirage of Atheism. Now, why do I believe that atheism is a mirage? Well, what is a mirage? A mirage essentially is an optical illusion. It's a misrepresentation of reality. It's a perspective that is not in line with the actual state of affairs. So it misrepresents the truth and misrepresents reality. And today I want to talk about three main areas why atheism is an intellectual mirage, because atheism doesn't make sense concerning the universe. Atheism doesn't make sense of the beginning of the universe. Atheism doesn't make sense of the dependency, the contingency of the universe. And atheism doesn't make sense of our natural born affinity to worship. Now I'm going to explain all of these points. Now, before I get into all of the points, I want you to realize that these are big topics. They are topics that require study. If you go on to if you progress at different levels, you would understand that there's a wide literature in academia, even in theology, concerning these topics. So I want you to appreciate that what I'm going to be talking to you about today is not everything. And I'm not giving you all the nuances and all the details. However, I'm giving you the essential framework and the basic concepts in order for you to have that sense of certainty, in order for you to grow. Because there is an Islamic principle, as many of you know, that doubt doesn't override certainty. So the way I'm going to present the three main areas today is going to be based on the kind of basic structure of the argument, the basic concepts, the fundamental ideas that are certain, and then that would allow you to grow. And then when you engage with these ideas, even if you don't know about something, or even if you have a question, it's not going to trouble you. It's not going to give you any doubt. Why? Because doubt doesn't override certainty. So we're going to start with the fundamentals, start with the basics, start with these key concepts that are intellectual in nature, but nevertheless you will be able to basically grasp them and have that sense of certainty, and then you'll be able to grow. Now, in saying that, every single one of you will be able to access a free copy, an e-copy, a PDF of my book, The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and the Mirage of Atheism, the newly revised edition. The PDF will be sent to you. The organizers are going to send you a link or a form. You just type in your details and you're going to receive the book for free. Now, that will be part of your journey to start fleshing out some of these ideas, to start studying further, to look into the references that the book refers to, some of the deeper concepts, some of the contentions and objections from the atheist and skeptic community that you could learn how to address. So this book could be the next stage, if you like, after this talk, in order for you to continue your intellectual and spiritual journey, inshallah. So with particular reference to the book, the arguments or the perspectives I'm going to be talking about today refer to certain chapters in the book. For example, I think it's chapter 4 or 5, when we're going to be talking about the Quranic argument for God's existence. Also, the chapter after that or before that is divine link, the argument from dependency. And we're going to be talking about chapter 15, which is the free slave, why God is worthy of worship. So some of the ideas I'm talking about today are going to come from these chapters, And for more information, for more nuances, for references, please go to these chapters. So why is atheism a mirage? Well, just to summarize what we said earlier on, atheism is a mirage because atheism doesn't make sense of the beginning of the universe. Atheism doesn't make sense because of the contingency, the dependency of the universe. And atheism doesn't make sense because of our natural born affinity to worship. And even if you don't believe in God, you're still worshiping something. And we're going to unpack the idea a little later on. So let's go to the first point. Atheism is a mirage because it doesn't make sense of the finitude, the beginning of the universe. And what I want to introduce to you today is the Quranic argument for God's existence, which is a very powerful argument, which shows that atheism is false, and it shows that believing in an uncreated creator is rational. Not only can we come to this conclusion using our sound aql, our sound intellect, but we can also access revelation, and revelation gives us this answer. Now, what's interesting, this argument is not just an argument that you have to believe in revelation. You can't say, oh, God exists because the Quran gives you an argument in the Quran, and you got to just believe in the Quran. No, we're not postulating such an argument. We're saying that this argument that we're going to be talking about now is logical and rational. It's in line with sound reason. It's universal, and it's in the Quran. We're not saying you have to believe in the Quran in order to articulate this argument. Because sometimes when you give this argument to atheists or you discuss this with atheists, they're like, oh, you've taken it from the Quran. I have to believe in the Quran. No, you don't have to believe in the Quran. Just listen to the argument. But the reason I like to call it the Quranic argument for God's existence, because it is from the Quran. And as you know, the arguments from the Quran are the most powerful arguments. They're the ones that can really awaken the truth within ourselves. They are the arguments that are the most profound, the most powerful, and yet they're simple at the same time. So what is the Quranic argument for God's existence? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran in chapter 52 verse 35 to 36, did you come from nothing? Did you create yourself? Did you create the heavens and the earth? Indeed, you have no certainty. So let's unpack that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about, first and foremost, the human being. Did you, the human being, and we know the human being is not eternal. It had a beginning. The human being had a beginning. I was born, you were born. We are finite in nature. So Allah is saying, did you, the human being, come from nothing? Did you create yourself? Did you create the heavens and the earth? Indeed, you have no certainty. So we could take the logic of this argument. There's an underlying logic behind this argument. So Allah is talking about the human being that is finite. It had a beginning. So you could apply this argument to anything that had a beginning. You could apply it to a bunch of keys. You can apply it to a boxing glove, right? You can apply it to anything that had a beginning, which also includes the universe. So Allah is saying, Allah is saying essentially from a logical perspective, did that thing that had a beginning, like a human being, like a bunch of keys, like a boxing bag, did that thing come from nothing? So that's the first possible explanation. Or did it create itself? That's the next possible explanation. Or if you remember what Allah says, did you, the human being, create the heavens and the earth? So the logic behind the third option is, well, did this thing that came into existence, did this thing that had a beginning, did this thing that came into existence, did it create something else that came into existence? Because when Allah says, did you create the heavens and the earth, where you are a finite being that came into existence, did you create a finite thing like the universe that came into existence? So the logic behind that is, what was the thing that did the thing that began to exist create something that also began to exist? And then Allah says, indeed, you have no certainty. Now, obviously, this is almost like a rhetorical ploy to make us understand that, the belief in an uncreated creator is in line with our fitrah, in line with our natural disposition. It's in line with our sound intellect, and it is the truth. So let me just summarize this. The underlying logic behind chapter 52, verse 35 to 36 is, did that thing that came into existence come from nothing? Number one. Did it create itself? Number 2. Did it create something else that was created? Number 3. Or was there an uncreated creator? So these are the 4 options, the 4 logical possibilities. Now, before we apply this to the universe now, we have to basically deal with the fact that the universe had a beginning. Because if you remember, these ayat are only applied to something that had a beginning. Because Allah mentions, خُلِقُوا, were you created from nothing? Now, this implies that Allah is talking about the human being that was makhluk, that came into existence, that the human being is muhdath, it came into being. So, in order to apply the logic of this Quranic argument, which is also a universal argument, you have to first start with the perspective or the position that the thing that you're talking about also came into existence, also had a beginning. So if we want to apply the logic of this argument to the universe, we have to first try and show that the universe had a beginning. Now, I don't want to get into the huge astrophysical debate about the universe coming into existence. I don't feel these are very strong arguments from a philosophical perspective. Why am I saying that? Well, very simple. You have to understand that, when we talk about the Big Bang model in academia, there are around 17 different models that explain the same data. And many of these models, they have equal epistemic weight. What does that mean? They have equal weight in terms of their truth value. So you could pick any of these models. Yes, there are debates and discussions, but generally speaking, there are around 17 different models to explain the same data. And so when you think of the Big Bang, you have to understand there are 17 different models that explain the data that is associated with the Big Bang. This is called in the philosophy of science underdetermination, meaning there are more than one model, there are more than one models that explain the same data, and each of the models are competing with each other, and they have somewhat the same value in truth. So this area of astrophysics, it's still growing, and from my perspective, philosophically speaking, it's not what you would call, anything with certainty. You cannot conclude anything with absolute certainty because we have limited observations concerning this reality. Even Professor Krauss, the physicist and the author of A Universe from Nothing, in his very book, he says these are speculative type of conclusions. We can't say anything with certainty because we don't have enough empirical evidence. Even and that's quite honest of him, because scientists, they have limitations, and usually the limitations are that they can't observe everything. They have limited observations. As Elliot Sober, the philosopher of science, and he's also an atheist, he says that scientists are restricted at any moment to the observations they have at hand. No one has an infinite number of observations or all the observations required for a particular phenomena, especially when it comes to astrophysics. So I'm not going to go into that to show that the universe began. I just want to basically show you that the universe began with a very, very simple thought experiment. Look at this boxing glove. If I said to you this boxing glove is eternal, what would you say to me? What would you say? You would say, Hamza, how can the boxing glove be eternal? Well, what if I say, no, it is eternal? This is an eternal boxing glove. This boxing glove never had a beginning. It was always there. It is eternal. It had no beginning. You're going to be like, that doesn't make any sense. Then I'm going to ask you, why doesn't it make any sense? Well, the reason you know that this boxing glove is not eternal, even though you didn't see the beginning, even though you didn't see it when it was made, even though you didn't see when it emerged into its boxing glove existence, the reason you know it's not eternal, because it has limited physical qualities. Okay? It has limited size. So this one is 16 ounces, right? It has limited colors, limited volume, shape, size, smell. Actually, this one smells all right. It has limited physical features. Now, given the fact that it has limited physical features, you know they had a beginning. Why? Because it cannot give rise to its own limitations. something external to the boxing glove gave rise to the limitations of the boxing glove, right? Let me give you another example. Let's take these keys. These keys have limited physical qualities, limited size, shape, weight, charge, smell, temperature. Now, these keys didn't give themselves their limitations. Something external to these keys gave rise to those limitations. Given that's the fact, then it means that these keys had a beginning and this boxing glove had a beginning, because it couldn't give rise to its own limitations by itself. There was something external to it before it in order for these things to exist with these limited physical qualities. Let me give another example just to make this very clear to you. Take this pen. This pen has limited color, limited shape, size, volume, smell, taste. I don't advise you eating a pen, but you get the point. Now, the pen didn't give rise to its own volume, length, size, weight, temperature, color. And we could ask the question, why is it the color purple and not any other color? Why is it this size or not any other size? Why is it this shape and not any other shape? Why is it this temperature and not any other temperature? Why is it this volume or not any other volume? And so on and so forth. Given the fact that we could raise these questions, we could now say, well, this pen didn't give rise to its own limitations. There must be something external to the pen before the pen to give rise to the pen with its limitations, because the pen cannot give rise to its own limitations, its own limited physical qualities, nor can the boxing glove, nor can the keys. Now, where am I going with this? Well, it's very simple. The universe is no different. The universe has limited physical qualities and it's made up of limited physical qualities. Even the most fundamental building blocks of the universe, if you want to call them quarks or virtual particles or subatomic particles, whatever the case may be, these things, whether we like it or not, have limited physical qualities. Now, given the fact that things with limited physical qualities cannot give rise to their own limitations, there must be something external to them that gave rise to those things with their limited physical qualities. And it's no different for the universe, given the fact that the universe is a physical thing and it's made up of physical things, even things that we can't see, things, there could be, things in the quantum reality. It doesn't really matter. The point is, they are physical and they have limited physical qualities. They can't give rise to their own limited physical qualities. Something external to them and therefore external to the universe gave rise to the universe with its limited physical qualities. So what does this mean? This means the universe had a beginning. Because in order for the universe to have its limited physical qualities, there must be something outside of it and something prior to it that gave rise to its limited physical qualities, which means the universe had a beginning. The universe is finite. Why? Because here is a principle. Anything with a limited physical quality is not eternal. Anything with a limited physical quality had a beginning. Just like the boxing bag, the boxing glove. When I said to you, this boxing glove is eternal, what did you say to me? You basically said, well, how can it be eternal? And I said, well, why don't you think it's not eternal? Because it has limited physical qualities. The principle is everything with limited physical qualities came into existence. It was finite. It wasn't always there because it can't give rise to its own limited physical qualities. Something outside of it gave rise to it with its limited physical qualities. Likewise, this whole universe has limited physical qualities. Therefore, and it can't give rise to its own limited physical qualities. Therefore, there was something outside of it before it to give rise to the universe with its limited physical qualities. And the universe is therefore finite. If it's finite, it can't be eternal because finite things have a beginning. So this is the easiest way of showing the universe had a beginning. You don't have to look into the science because science changes. You don't have to go into mathematics. It could be quite complicated. It's based on a really key rational principle that things with limited physical qualities can't give rise to themselves. There was something outside of it to give rise to it and its limited physical qualities, which means it's finite. And it's no different from the universe. The universe has limited physical qualities. It can't give rise to its own limited physical qualities. There was something outside of the universe that gave rise to the universe with its limited physical qualities. If that's the case, the universe had a beginning. It is finite. Good. So since the universe is finite, had a beginning, we can now apply the logic of the Quranic argument. Let's go back to remind ourselves what we were saying. Well, the Quranic argument, the logic behind the Quranic argument is things that had a beginning, things that are finite, either came from nothing, they created themselves, they were created by something else created, or there is an uncreated creator. Okay? It was created by an uncreated creator. Let's go back again. The Quran is saying that things that are finite, obviously the Quranic verses speak specifically about the human being, but since the human being is finite, it's khuliqu, it came into existence, it's makhluk, it's muhdath. You could apply this to anything that had a beginning, anything that is finite. So the Quran is saying, did that finite thing come from nothing? Did it create itself? Was it created by something else created? Or was it created by an uncreated creator? So let's logically and rationally work our way through these. So number one, could the universe come from nothing? Well, this is absolutely absurd because from nothing, nothing comes. But before we get a little bit more into this, we have to really understand, what do we mean by nothing? Now, what we mean by nothing in this context is basically the absence of anything, no prior causal conditions, no prior causal activity, no potential, the absence of anything. The absence of anything. And this is very important because the concept of nothing is a universal negation. We're not talking about the kind of nothing that some scientists are talking about, that nothing is the absence of time and space, but it's still something, like a quantum vacuum. But a quantum vacuum is actually still something. You can't say it's nothing in this sense. So what we're saying here is that nothing means the absence of anything, no potential, no prior causal conditions, no prior causal activity. This is what we mean by nothing. So the universe couldn't come from nothing in this sense, because from nothing, nothing comes. If you have some nothing and add more nothing, if you like, all you're going to get is nothing. Think of it mathematically. 0 plus 0 plus 0 is actually 0. And what's even worse here is, well, the logical implications of saying that something can come from nothing. Now, if you could mirror it logically, and you could do a kind of logical assessment with its opposite. Because if you're saying that something can come from nothing, then it also means that something can disappear into nothing. So if something can come from nothing, then it logically also is the same for the other way around, that something can go into nothing, it can disappear, it could vanish, right? It can become nothing without any explanation. Let me give an example. To say something can come from nothing is logically equivalent if you mirror it from this perspective. Imagine you just close your eyes and all of a sudden your room and your house disappears. You should, if you're consistent, if you believe something can come from nothing, then you should also believe that something could vanish, can become nothing as well. So since if you close your eyes and your bedroom and your house disappears, you should find it reasonable that the house has disappeared for no reason, because of no cause, because of nothing going on. It just happened. But no one would ever expect that, because it's irrational. Well, if that's irrational, then the universe coming from nothing is also irrational, because that is its logical equivalent. Imagine, for example, Richard Dawkins, he gets a call from his bank manager, and all the millions he's made from writing his fiction books, right? You know, his bank manager says, Professor Dawkins, your millions of pounds that you made from writing your fiction books have now just vanished into nothing. Would Richard Dawkins accept such an explanation? Of course not. But if he believes the universe came from nothing, he should accept such an explanation, because that is the logical equivalent. And this is why it is absurd to say the universe came from nothing. So some argue, well, what about the quantum vacuum? You know, some scientists say that you have virtual particles coming from the quantum vacuum, and therefore that means something can come from nothing. No, no, no. This is a misunderstanding. You remember how we define nothing. Nothing is universal negation. Nothing means no absence of anything. Nothing means no prior causal activity, no potential. Now, the quantum vacuum is not nothing in this sense. The quantum vacuum is still something. It is a rich structure. It is a sea of fluctuating energy. So when a virtual particle emerges from this vacuum, it's not necessarily something coming from nothing. It's something coming from something. Now, another argument one would argue is, well, what about God? You're saying that something can't come from nothing, but doesn't God create from nothing? Well, this is a slight misunderstanding concerning the theological sense of nothing and the nothing that we're talking about here now. Yes, it's very true that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates. He says, be and it is. Kun fayakun. So Allah creates. There could be nothing apart from Allah, and Allah creates something. We know that. But there's no contradiction here. Why? Because it's a subtle misunderstanding of Allah creating from nothing and something coming from nothing. Why? Because when we say Allah creates from nothing, we're saying Allah creates from no material stuff. He wills it and it becomes. That's not the same as something coming from nothing. Why? Because there is something already there. Allah is in existence, and via His will and power, something comes into existence as well. So it's not the case of something coming from an absolute nothing, because Allah exists, right? And the prior causal conditions or the prior causal activity is Allah's irada and His qudra, His power and His will. So Allah's power and will are the prior causal conditions to bring the universe into existence. So it's not the case of, oh, you're saying that something can't come from nothing. What about God? Doesn't He create from nothing? It's a disanalogy. You can't compare. Why? Because when we say Allah creates from nothing in a theological sense, we're not saying there is nothing at all, and even Allah doesn't exist. Na'udhu billah. We're saying that Allah creates from no material stuff. But that doesn't mean there is no prior causal condition, because the prior causal condition is Allah's will and power. So it's not the case of something coming from nothing as what we've just spoken about now in the context of this argument. So when an atheist says, there's a contradiction here, you guys are saying something can't come from nothing, but God creates from nothing. But there is a subtle difference here. The nothing that we talk about in a theological sense means that God creates from no material stuff. It's just His will and power. That's not the same as saying something can come from nothing, because Allah is not nothing. Na'udhu billah. Allah exists, and there is something there prior to the universe, which is Allah's will and power. And Allah's will and power brings the universe into existence. So hopefully you've understood this point. And this is further clarified in my book in the relevant chapter as well. So we know the universe cannot come from nothing. That's the first option out the way. Second option, well, the universe created itself. Well, this is absurd. Look at this boxing glove. Could this boxing glove make itself? No. Could these keys make themselves? No. Could this pen make itself? No. Could I give birth to myself? No. Could our mothers give birth to themselves? No. Exactly. And this really undermines the argument that the universe created itself. Because think about it logically. For something to create itself, it means it was in existence and not in existence at the same time, which is an impossibility. And it also means that it was there before it came into existence. Again, an impossibility. And it also means that you should attribute power to the universe before the universe exists. Absolute crazy stuff. So we know the second option is not true, that it couldn't be the case that the universe created itself. But the third option, sorry, that's 4, this is 3. The third option. Well, the third option is, well, something created was created by something else created. So the universe, which is something created, it had a beginning, was created by something else that was created, for example, like another universe. Well, that is not plausible. Maybe at first instance, you might be like, yeah, that makes sense because I was born, my mother gave birth to me, and then her mother gave birth to her, and they're all created, they all came into existence, and that can go on. But ultimately, this is not an explanation because it can't go on forever. That's the point. Because if you're saying, for example, the universe was created or came into existence because of another universe before that, well, let's ask the question. Did that universe come into existence as well? Yes, it did. Because remember what we're saying, the option is something created was created by something else created. So if that universe that created this universe was also created, what about another universe? Then therefore it must have been created by something else created as well, like another universe. Well, is that universe created as well? Yes. Well, if that goes on forever, we wouldn't have the universe today. Let me explain this again. If this universe was created by another universe, and that universe was created by another universe, and that universe was created by another universe, and that goes ad infinitum forever, we would never have the universe today because of the absurdity of the infinite regress of causes. Let me give you another thought experiment. Imagine I had in the UK, we have a water balloon. When it's summer, you have a balloon and you fill it with water and you throw it at your friends and you play these games. Now imagine I wanted to throw a water balloon at you. But before I throw the water balloon at you, I have to get the causal power. In other words, the permission from my friend behind me in order for me to throw the water balloon. But he says, you know what? Before I give you permission, Hamza, I have to ask permission to give you permission. And that goes on forever because that person also has to ask permission. If that goes on forever, will I ever throw the water balloon at you? No. Likewise, if this universe was as a result of something else that was created, like another universe, and then that universe came into being, was as a result of something else that came into existence, like another universe, and that goes on forever, we will never have the universe today. But since we do have the universe today, then the only option is that there was an uncreated creator. Because we said the universe couldn't come from nothing. The universe couldn't create itself. It couldn't be created by something else created ultimately. Therefore, the universe had an uncreated creator. Khalas. This is why atheism doesn't make sense, because they deny an uncreated creator. Atheism is an intellectual mirage because it denies an uncreated creator. But our sound reason, the Quranic argument, our sound intellectual faculties can come to the conclusion that there is an uncreated creator, because the universe had a beginning and we could raise certain questions. Did it come from nothing? We know it couldn't come from nothing. Did it create self? No, we know it couldn't create self. Was it created by something else that was created? Ultimately, no, as we just discussed, because of the absurdity of the infinite regress of causes. Therefore, there is an uncreated creator. That's why the first point, atheism is a mirage, because it doesn't make sense of the finitude, the beginning of the universe. Second argument, the argument from dependency. Now, this is a very powerful argument, and you could use this argument by staring at a wall, by staring at a pen, by staring at a bunch of keys, by staring at a boxing glove. You can derive God's existence by just looking at these things. We're not going to do that for now, but let's just understand what this argument really means. Now, this argument from dependency is also known in philosophy as the argument from contingency. But I like to use the word dependency because it's more in line with our theological discourse. But one can also use the word contingency. Now, what we're saying here is that the whole universe is dependent, and it has to derive its existence from an independent, necessary being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because in our classical tradition, in the books of Aqidah, Allah is also described as wajib al-wujud, the necessary existing thing. Because anything other than Allah is mumkin al-wujud, is potentially existing from that point of view, because it could have not existed. Yeah. So what we're saying is that the whole universe is dependent, and everything within it and everything that we perceive And the only explanation for the dependency of the universe is that there's an independent, eternal, necessary being. But in order for us to really unpack this and understand this properly, we have to understand, what do we mean by dependency in the context of this argument? There are four things that we mean by dependency. Four things, okay? When we say something is dependent, we're saying something is not necessary. Now, what does necessary mean in the language of philosophy, even in the language of theology? Now, when something necessarily exists, it means that it was impossible for it to have not existed. Let me repeat. When we say something necessarily exists, it means that it was impossible for it to have not existed. Okay? Now, when we're saying something is dependent, we're saying that it was possible for it to have not existed. Let me give an example. Imagine I go from upstairs to downstairs in my house. I go to the kitchen, I open the fridge freezer, and I see a pen on top of an egg box. Now, do I close the fridge and say, you know, the pen sitting on top of the egg box necessarily exists? No. I actually question why is the pen on top of the egg box? Because I know that the pen has an explanation. There is an explanation external to the pen, an explanation external to the pen that provides a reason for why the pen is on top of the egg box. There's nothing necessary about the existence of the pen on top of the egg box, okay? Because it could have not existed. The pen could have been in the egg box. The pen could have been on top of the fridge. The pen could have not been there at all. There is nothing necessary about the existence of the pen on top of the egg box. Now, by virtue of the pen in the fridge on top of the egg box, I want an explanation. And the reason I want an explanation, because I know it doesn't necessarily exist on top of the egg box. And I know that the pen didn't have to be there. It was possible for it to have not exist in the way that it does in my fridge. Okay? So this is very important to understand. This is what we mean by dependent. When we mean something is dependent, we mean that it is not necessary, which means that it was possible for it to have not existed. It was possible for it to have not existed in the way that it does, right? It could have not existed at all, or it could have existed in another way. This is what we mean by something being dependent. That's the first meaning. The second meaning when we're saying something is dependent is that the fundamental building blocks of that particular thing could have been arranged in a different way. Let me give an example. Imagine you're driving your car and you're passing a roundabout. And on the roundabout, there is this grassy area and there is an arrangement of flowers, okay? And the arrangement of flowers basically says, I love you, okay? Now, the fundamental building blocks of that flower arrangement is each of the individual flowers. Now, the fundamental building blocks of that flower arrangement that says, I love you, could have been arranged in a different way. There's nothing necessary about that arrangement. And we know by virtue of the arrangement, because of that arrangement, that there's an external explanation that explains the arrangement of the flowers that says, I love you. It could have been a gust of wind, for example. It could have been a gardener that was hired by the local government to basically arrange the flowers in that particular way. And we know there's nothing necessary about that arrangement, because instead of saying, I love you, it could have said, I adore you, or I like you, or have a nice day. The point is, the fundamental building blocks of that flower arrangement didn't have to be the way that they are. They could have been different. And not only that, there is an external explanation to explain the arrangement of the fundamental building blocks. In this case, it could have been a gust of wind, highly unlikely, I know, or it could have been a gardener. Okay? Now, that's the second definition of dependency. The third definition of dependency is something is dependent in the normal dictionary sense of the word. I am dependent on food in order to exist. I'm not self-subsisting, okay? I don't exist, independently, and I don't have any needs. I am needy. I am dependent. I don't self-subsist. I need things external to me, like oxygen and food, in order to survive. So that's the third definition. The fourth definition is something I'd said earlier in the first argument, so it's very good we covered it, which is dependent things have limited physical qualities. Like this pen. This pen has limited physical qualities. It has a certain color, size, temperature, volume, etc., etc. So, and we could raise the question, why is it this color and not another color? Why is it this length and not another length? Why is it this wide and not another width? Why is it this weight and not another weight? Why is it this temperature and not another temperature? Why is it this volume and not another volume? Why is it this density and not another density? The point here is, the reason we could raise these questions is because they could have been otherwise. And it gives rise to the fact that, well, did this pen give rise to its own limitations? Of course not. There must be something external to the pen that gave rise to the pen with its limited physical qualities. So dependent things have limited physical qualities, meaning there is an external explanation, an external reason outside of the thing that gave rise to the thing's limited physical qualities. Okay? So those are the four meanings of dependency. Now let's apply this to the universe and everything that we perceive. Number one, is the universe not necessary? Of course it is. There's nothing necessary about the universe. We can't say it was impossible for the universe to have not existed. Even physicists say that the universe could have been a different type of universe with a different type of physical structure and maybe physical laws. There's nothing necessary about the universe. In actual fact, the universe didn't have to exist at all. There's nothing in science that tells us that this universe that we live in is necessarily existing from the point of view that it was impossible for it to have not existed. Okay, so we know that the universe, everything that we exist, could have been a different universe, and it could have not existed at all. So this means it's dependent, which means there must be an external explanation for the universe, because how did the universe come to be? Just like what we said about the fridge and the pen on top of the egg box, we said, well, there is an external explanation for the pen being on top of the egg box, right? There's nothing necessary about the pen existing on top of the egg box. Therefore, there is an external explanation to explain the pen on top of the egg box. Likewise, there's nothing necessary about the universe. It could have not existed. Therefore, there is an external explanation for the universe. The second definition is that the arrangement of the fundamental building blocks. Well, we know that the fundamental building blocks of the universe are arranged in a particular way. They could have been arranged in a totally different way. And therefore, there needs to be an external explanation to explain why it's one arrangement over another possible arrangement. Okay, just like with the flowers in the roundabout, it said, I love you, the fundamental building blocks being the individual flowers. They could have been arranged in a different way that said, I hate you, or I like you, or have a nice day. And the reason they are in the way that they are at the moment that says, I love you, is because there is an external explanation, such as a gust of wind or a gardener that explains that particular arrangement. Likewise, with the universe, its fundamental building blocks, you could, whatever you believe them to be, you go ask the scientists what they are. You could call them virtual particles, subatomic particles, some quantum reality. It doesn't really matter. The point here is that there are fundamental building blocks of the universe, and they're arranged in a particular way. There's nothing necessary about that arrangement. They could have been arranged in a different way. Therefore, just like the arrangement of flowers, there's an external explanation that explains that particular arrangement. The other point is the universe is dependent in the normal dictionary sense of the term, that it's not self-subsisting. It just didn't exist by itself. The fourth definition is that the universe has limited physical qualities. Now, we've discussed this already. The universe is a physical structure. Yes, it's huge and vast, but it's a physical structure. It has a particular size. Even if it's growing, for example, and expanding, it still has a finite size. The universe is not eternal from that point of view. And its fundamental building blocks also have limited physical qualities, and things that we perceive within the universe have limited physical qualities. And as we discussed previously, things with limited physical qualities can't give rise to their own limitations. There must be something external to that thing, prior to that thing, that gave rise to that thing and its limited physical qualities. Likewise, the universe, even though it's huge and massive, the universe is a physical structure. It's limited, it's not infinite. And we also know that the fundamental building blocks that make up the universe and also the things within the universe have limited physical qualities. Therefore, the sum of all of that has something external to it that explains it and how it has these limited physical qualities. Because if you remember, things with limited physical qualities can't give rise to their own limited physical qualities. So what we've shown so far now is the universe is dependent. It's not necessarily existing, and therefore it can't be eternal. Right, so where do we go from here? So since the universe is dependent, there are three possible explanations. Number one, the universe is independent and therefore eternal. Number two, the universe and everything that we perceive is dependent on something else dependent. And number three, the universe and everything that we perceive is dependent on something independent, necessary, and it exists eternally. It's eternally existing. So let me repeat. There are three possible explanations, rational possible explanations, given what we've discussed so far. Number one, the universe is independent and therefore eternal. So the universe and everything we perceive is independent and therefore eternal. Number two, the universe and everything we perceive is dependent on something else that is dependent. And number three, the universe and everything that we perceive is dependent on something independent, necessary, and eternal. So let's work our way through these perspectives. Number one, the universe is independent and therefore eternal. I'm sorry, this is not a good argument. It's a bit of a cop-out. I do apologize, because we've just discussed at length why the universe is dependent. If it's dependent, it can't be independent. Because what does independent really mean? It means that thing necessarily exists. It means that there's nothing external to it that explains it. And it also means that it was impossible for it to have not existed. But given that we spent some time showing the dependent nature of the universe, this is not a very good argument. So let's go to the second option. The universe and everything that we perceive is dependent on something else dependent. Again, this can't be the case because it's not providing any explanation. All you're saying is the thing that requires an explanation is explained by something that requires an explanation. Because remember, dependent things have something external to them that explain the limited physical qualities, the fundamental building blocks being arranged in a particular way, etc., etc. So when you're saying this dependent thing, the universe and everything that we perceive is also dependent on something else dependent, then you're basically saying something that requires an explanation is explained by something that requires an explanation, which is not an explanation at all. Also, remember what we said in the first argument, the Quranic argument for God's existence, the infinite regress of causes. We know that it is absurd, irrational to have an infinite regress of causes. Likewise, if this universe and everything that we perceive derives its existence is dependent on something else that is dependent, and that thing that's dependent also dependent on something else dependent, and that goes on forever, we will never have the universe today. So this option again is false. So what's the third option? The universe and everything we perceive is dependent on something independent, necessary, and eternal. And this is the most rational explanation to explain the dependency of the universe, that it actually derives its existence and it depends on something independent and it is eternal. Why is it eternal? Because things that are finite, okay, things that are finite are dependent. Okay, things that are finite are dependent, and things that are independent are eternal. So since the universe derives its existence from something that is independent, given that it's independent, it also has to be eternal. And this makes sense of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah says He is al-Ghani, He is the independent. Allah says He is as-Samad. Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Allahu Samad. Samad, meaning the self-subsisting, meaning that everything derives existence from this being, this eternal creator. So this makes sense of the existence of God. And for more information, go to the relevant chapter in my book, and to do with certain contentions. But let's deal with one objection. It's quite a popular objection. Actually, two objections. One objection to this argument is, oh, this is God of the gaps. You know, you have a limited, you have a gap in your scientific understanding, but in the future, when we progress scientifically, we're going to fill the gap, and it will basically, we would not need God as an explanation. I'm sorry. This argument is a metaphysical argument. It absorbs all scientific information. Even if you had a new scientific theory 5,000 years ahead from today, this argument still works. Why? Because science can only deal with things that are dependent, are contingent. Science cannot deal with things that are necessarily existing, because as the philosopher of science, Elliot Sober, says that scientists are restricted to the observations they have at hand, direct and indirect observations. The minute you can observe it is the minute you know it's a dependent thing, because you cannot observe something that is independent, something that is necessarily existing, something that is eternal. You can't observe that. You only observe contingency. You observe things with limited physical qualities, and that's the nature of observations. So given the fact that science can only give us theories or give us conclusions that are dependent in nature, then science cannot deal with this argument at all, because this argument transcends science. For example, you know, science can say that you have an infinite number of universes, and these infinite number of universes explain this universe, for example. No, it doesn't. All you explain is dependency with more dependency, because all of these individual universes are still dependent, right? They're not necessarily existing. They're not independent and eternal from that point of view. So what we have to understand is that the science objection is not really an objection, because anything that science can give us can only refer to dependent things. So when you engage in a scientific theory or you try to derive a scientific conclusion, you can only refer to dependent things. That's the nature of science. This is the scope of his methodology. This is the philosophy of science. Not one scientist and not one philosopher of science will say to you that science can refer to eternal independent things, because that would mean that science now has gone outside of its method and its scope, and it's going into metaphysics and philosophy. Generally speaking, science can't do that. Science is restricted to the observations that it has at hand, direct and indirect observations, and the things that we can observe directly or indirectly are dependent. So all science can do is give you a dependent solution to this argument. But if you're giving a dependent solution, you're not solving the problem, because you're saying the universe that is dependent is also deriving its existence from something else that is dependent. And we already said that this is a false conclusion, because you can't have an infinite regress of dependencies. Another argument here is, well, isn't this a logical fallacy? Isn't this the logical fallacy of the fallacy of composition? So what's the fallacy of composition? The logical fallacy of the fallacy of composition basically says that you can't say that the whole has the same property as its individual parts. Okay? For example, take a Persian rug. A Persian rug is quite heavy, especially if you buy a really expensive one. It's a heavy rug. Now, it would be absurd to say that the Persian rug is light in weight, because the individual parts that make up the Persian rug, the threads, are very light. This is true. This is the logical fallacy applied here, the fallacy of composition. It's not always true that the whole is going to have the same properties as its individual parts. Just like a Persian rug is actually very heavy, even though its individual parts are the small threads. So it would be absurd to say the Persian rug is very light in weight, given the fact that its individual parts, the threads, are also light in weight. So this logical fallacy can be applied, but you have to understand when it can be applied and when it can't be applied. Because in some cases, you can't apply it. For example, take a brick wall. A brick wall is hard. The whole brick wall is hard. And its individual parts, the individual bricks, are also hard. So it can be the case that the whole has the same property or properties as its individual part. In this case, the wall is hard and its individual building blocks, its individual parts, the brick, is also hard. So it's not a universal fallacy. It's not always fallacious to say that the whole has the same property as its individual part or parts. Likewise with the universe. Because what they're saying here is, oh, you've committed a logical fallacy because everything in the universe is contingent, or anything in the universe is dependent, therefore the universe is dependent. You can't say that because the whole doesn't have the same property as its parts. Just like the Persian rug. We agree, but you can't apply it to the universe. Why? Because the universe is more like the brick wall. Because if everything we perceive within the universe is dependent and its fundamental building blocks of the universe are dependent, then we can say the whole universe is dependent, and we're not accused of committing the fallacy of composition. Why? Because of the principle of dependency. The principle of dependency is as follows. Dependent things make up dependent wholes. Dependent individual things make up dependent wholes. And for them to deny this, they have to prove how dependent things do not make up dependent wholes, which is absolutely impossible. So that's why this contention is not a valid contention. So So atheism, again, is an intellectual mirage because it doesn't make sense of the dependency of the universe. Final point. Everybody worships. Atheism doesn't make sense of our natural born tendency to worship. You have to understand, brothers and sisters and friends, even if you don't believe in God, you're worshipping something. As Martin Ling said, man cannot not worship. Man cannot not worship. Now, interestingly, in the Islamic tradition, worship is quite profound. It means four main things. It entails four main things. That you know Allah, that you love Allah, that you obey Allah, and that includes being humble before Allah, and that you direct all your action, all your acts of worship to Allah alone. You single out and you direct all your acts of worship to Allah alone. The internal acts of worship, the actions of the heart, and the acts of worship of the limbs. So this is what worship entails, brothers and sisters, that you know Allah, you love Allah, you obey Allah, and you direct all acts of worship to Allah alone. The internal acts of worship, the actions of the heart, and the actions of the limbs. Now, this is very important because if you take the logic of this, everybody worships. Because remember what we said, what worship entails, that you know Allah, you love Allah, you obey Allah, and you direct all acts of worship to Allah alone. Let's take the logic of this. Something that you want to know the most, something that you love the most, something that you obey the most, something that you direct your acts of worship towards the most, like gratitude, because gratitude is an act of the heart, it's an action of the heart, ultimate gratitude. If you want to know something the most, you want to love something the most, you obey something the most, and you are ultimately grateful towards something the most, that is your object of worship. And what's interesting, even for the atheist, at some point in their life, they want to know something the most. At some point in their life, they want to love something or many things the most. At some point in their life, they're obeying something or someone or something or an idea the most. At some point in their life, they're displaying gratitude in their heart, ultimate gratitude for something or some things the most. That is their object of worship. And this is so true that you can't run away from worship. human beings are natural born worshippers. The point is, whom deserves your worship? And this is very interesting because the beautiful chapter in the Quran, chapter 39, verse 29, and I'm paraphrasing, when Allah says, consider the situation of two people. One man is a servant to many masters, and they're all arguing. And another man, he's a servant to one master. Whose condition is best? Obviously, the one with a better condition is the one who's a slave, who is a servant to one master. If you're a servant to many masters and they're all arguing, you're finished, right? So from that point of view, Allah is trying to say to us, if you don't worship Allah, your one true master, you're worshipping all these other things. So if you want true freedom, true liberation, then worship the one who knows you better than you know yourself, and the one who has more affection for you than your own mother, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So from that point of view, the default position of human beings is to worship even if they deny God. And that's why atheism doesn't make sense of this natural born tendency to worship, because they end up worshipping something that is not worthy of worship. So the question now is, well, why is Allah worthy of worship? This is one of my favorite topics. I have a free essay on my website called 7 Reasons Why Allah is Worthy of Worship. I think that's the title. Check it out on hamza.com. There's a chapter in my book on this. There's a lecture on my YouTube channel on this. And it's about why Allah is worthy of worship. I'm just going to give you 2 main reasons. The reason we should worship Allah and not other things is because, number one, Allah is worthy of worship by virtue of who He is, because of who He is. Now, let me explain this. Brothers and sisters, we praise things and people because of their attributes. For example, we will praise poets, like the famous poet Iqbal, when he said, this one prostration, this one sajda that you find so difficult frees you from 1,000 sajdas. We may praise him for his eloquence, or for his rhetoric, or for his poetic skill. Likewise, we may praise soccer players, Ronaldo or Messi, for their soccer attributes and abilities, athletic attributes. We may praise Khabib for being a great wrestler. By the way, his father passed away yesterday, a few days ago. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy on him and grant his father Jannat al-Firdaus and forgive his sins and make it easy for all the family. Ameen. So we may praise Khabib because of his wrestling attributes and skills. But the interesting thing here is, brothers and sisters, their attributes, they may be great, but they're not perfect because they're human. And they're not maximally perfect. They're not to the highest degree possible. And they have some limitations and flaws. But yet we praise the poet by virtue of their poetic skills and attributes. We praise the soccer player by virtue of the athletic abilities and soccer attributes and skills. And we praise the MMA wrestler by virtue of his skills, even though their skills and attributes are limited and flawed in some way. No one's perfect, and they have deficiencies and flaws. We praise them. We say bravo. We give a standing ovation. Our heart is compelled to praise them because of who they are. If that's the case, then what does it mean how we must praise Allah because of who He is? Because Allah's names and attributes are maximally perfect to the highest degree possible. They have no deficiency and no flaw. We must give Allah an extensive praise, and praise is a form of worship. In Kitab is Surah Al-Fatiha, the mother of the whole book, the whole Quran. In the first line of Kitab of Surah Al-Fatiha, that summarizes the Quran, which is a summarize of Tawheed, a summarization of the whole of Tawheed. Allah says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All perfect praise and gratitude belong to the Lord of everything that exists. Extensive praise is a form of worship. So if we could praise all of these things, and these things don't really directly benefit us in any way, and their attributes are limited and flawed and not perfect, what does it mean about praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because it means that we must give Him an extensive praise because His names and attributes are to the highest degree possible. They are maximally perfect. They have no deficiency and no flaw. So if we can praise deficient things that are flawed in some way and they don't directly benefit us in any way, then what does it mean about giving Allah an extensive form of praise? And praise is worship. And that's why Allah is worthy of worship, because of who He is. And not because of how He's decided to manifest his names and attributes in our lives. Maybe we don't have a great life. We live in poverty. We haven't been given many bounties. Allah is still worthy of praise because of who he is. So that's the first point. And this is very important because we shouldn't have a transactional relationship with Allah, that we only worship Allah if he gives us something. No, this is a false understanding. This is making you a peer with Allah, which I would argue could be a form of shirk, of course, because you're saying, Allah, you know what? I give you salah if you give me some wealth, some health, family, wife, kids, and I give you my ibadah. No. Allah is worthy of worship even if you receive the crumbs of the universe. In actual fact, Allah is worthy of worship even if the whole universe decided not to worship him. And Allah is worthy of worship even if the universe worships him. And Allah's bounty and majesty will not be decreased if people don't worship him. And Allah's bounty and majesty will not be increased if people start to worship him. Such is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the first point why Allah is worthy of worship. The second point is Allah is Al-Khaliq. He is the creator. He is Al-Khalaq. He is the perpetually creating. Now, what does this mean in the context of worship? Now, there is something in your lives that you receive every moment of your existence that you don't earn, own, or deserve, but it's freely given to you and it's priceless. What is this thing? This thing is every conscious moment of your existence, life itself. You don't earn it, own it, or deserve it. You can't even create a fly. It's priceless. Why? Because if I said to you, you had 10 minutes left to live, and in order to have another 10 hours or 10 days, you have to give me all of your wealth, you will throw all of your wealth at me. Such is the priceless nature of life. So we receive something that is priceless, that we don't earn, own, or deserve at every moment, which is life itself. How should it make us feel? It should make us feel grateful. And gratitude is a key to worship. And we must be grateful to Allah. We shouldn't be like those people who receive a free, priceless gift every day, and we start thanking the gift and not the one who gave it to us. We must be grateful, ultimately grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So this is why Allah is also worthy of worship. So because he's worthy of extensive praise by virtue of who he is, and because he's worthy of ultimate gratitude because of what we just discussed. There's many other reasons. We don't have time for that. Go to chapter 15 in the book when you get it. Go onto my website, hamza.com. There is a lecture on this topic and an essay on this topic as well. So to summarize, 3 main reasons why atheism is an intellectual mirage. It misrepresents reality. It's an intellectual optical illusion. Number 1, atheism doesn't make sense of the beginning of the universe. The atheist position on this doesn't make sense. We know there must have been an uncreated creator. Atheism doesn't make sense because of the dependency of the universe. We know there must have been an independent, necessary, eternal being that gave rise to the universe. And atheism doesn't make sense based on the fact of our natural born tendency to worship, because everyone is in a state of worship, as we said. And the one who's worthy of worship is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We must worship him. And even if they don't believe in God, they still worship something, because what does worship entail? Something that you want to know the most, love the most, obey the most, or refer to the most, and something that you express acts of worship to the most, such as ultimate gratitude. People who believe in God or not have an object of worship. But the question is, whom is worthy of worship? And we said Allah is worthy of worship based on those 2 small points that we made. And you could do your further research based on the references that I've given you. So before we end, I just want to answer 2 main points. There are certain issues that come up concerning the atheist-theist dialogue. Number 1, if God is so merciful, why is there so much evil and suffering in the universe? Well, this is a really false argument. I've written about this in my book. It's also on my website for free, hamza.com. And there's other people who have written about this as well. Please check other people's work as well. Now, for me, this is a baseless argument. It's very emotional. It's not intellectual. They're saying, if God is loving or merciful or good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? And since there is so much evil and suffering in the world, then God can't be good. Now, the reason they say this is because if God is good, loving, and powerful, then he should want the evil to stop, and he should have the ability to stop it. But since evil exists, Either he doesn't have the ability to stop it, or he doesn't, or he's evil. He wants it to continue. This is a false argument because it's based on two false assumptions. Now, obviously, I'm summarizing this. You have to go to the references I've given you. But the summary of the response is as follows. There are two false assumptions. The first false assumption is that he assumes that Allah, that God, is only good, only loving, and powerful. This is false. Allah is also Al-Hakim, Al-Alim. He is the wise. He is the knowing. He has the totality of the wisdom and knowledge. Allah has the picture. We just have a pixel. We just have a pixel. So if Allah is all-knowing and all-wise, then it solves the problem. Because evil and suffering in the world exists based on a divine wisdom and a divine knowledge. Even if we can't understand that divine wisdom and knowledge, the point is it doesn't mean it's not there. So the atheists, they misrepresent who God is in the Islamic tradition. They're saying God is good and powerful and loving, and that's it. Well, if that was just the case, they may have an argument. But it's not just the case, because Allah is also Al-Alim, Al-Hakim, the knowing and the wise. Given the fact that he's knowing and the wise, therefore, there is a wisdom and a reason and knowledge for why these things occur. So it breaks down the argument logically. Second point, that the second false assumption of the argument is that Allah hasn't given us any good reasons why there's evil and suffering in the first place. But Allah has. If you look at the Quran and Sunnah, there are so many reasons. Number one, life is a test, right? We're here to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which also includes we're here to be tested, and so on and so forth. So they have two false assumptions concerning the problem of evil and suffering. Number one, they misrepresent who God is. They think he's just good and powerful and loving, which is not true. He's also the wise and the knowing, which solves this problem. And also, they assume that Allah hasn't given us any good reason why there's evil and suffering in the first place, but he has. Primarily, we have a purpose in life, is to worship Allah, and that includes that we're going to be tested. And that summarizes a response to that false argument. Another argument they have is, oh, we have science. Science now denies God. No, this is not true. Anyone who actually studies science, someone who studies the philosophy of science, you would know that the question of God is not even really a scientific question. What science can do is at best keep silent on the topic, or maybe provide certain evidences that you can use a philosophical argument to use some of those evidences, develop a philosophical argument to either talk about God's existence or try and suggest that he doesn't exist. But science cannot deny God's existence in of itself. Yes, you can use scientific data to form a philosophical argument, but that won't be scientific anymore. But the point is, science in of itself cannot deal with the question of God. Why? As we said before, Professor Elliot Sober, an atheist, a philosopher of science, he basically said that at any point in time, scientists are restricted to the observations they have at hand. Science deals with direct or indirect observations. God is not observed. God is outside of the universe. That's the classical understanding of the divine. Creation is distinct and disjoined from the universe. Allah is transcendent. Laysa kamithlihi shay. There is nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the scientific method can't be applied to the God question directly from that point of view. Also, you have to understand that generally speaking, scientific conclusions have to adopt something called methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is that for any scientific conclusion to be scientific, you can't refer to divine power or divine creativity or God's power or God's existence. This doesn't mean they reject God. They're just saying for a conclusion to be scientific, it can't refer to the God stuff, right? God can't refer to God in any way. This is very different from saying that God doesn't exist. That would be philosophical naturalism, which is different from the methodological naturalism. Philosophical naturalism basically says that God doesn't exist, there is no divine, there is no supernatural, and everything can be explained via physical processes. All phenomena can be explained via physical processes. That's very different from methodological naturalism, which just basically says, in order for something to be scientific, you can't refer to God. But that doesn't deny God. So what some atheists do, they confuse philosophical naturalism with methodological naturalism. Now, just because scientific conclusions don't usually refer to God, they now think, therefore God doesn't exist. No, that's not true, because that's only if you adopt philosophical naturalism. But methodological naturalism just basically says, for something to be scientific, you can't refer to God's existence, but it doesn't mean he doesn't exist. As you know, a famous biology, Scott E. Todd, I believe, he said that, you know, just because a scientist is committed to methodological naturalism, meaning that scientific conclusions can't refer to God, it doesn't mean they can't believe in God for other reasons, like philosophical or theological reasons. So they conflate methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism. For more information on this, there's a chapter in my book called, I think it's called Does Science Deny God? But it's about deconstructing the false atheist assumptions concerning the argument that science denies God. So please read that chapter as well. So we're done. We are done with 5 minutes and 40 seconds remaining for the end of the lecture. So we're going to open now to Q&A, inshallah. Concerning the argument that science denies God. So please read that chapter as well.
Jazakallah khairan, Brother Hamza, for that enlightening talk. I'm sure we all benefited immensely from it. And now, before we move on to the question and answer session, I would just like to remind the viewers that to receive your free version of the book authored by Brother Hamza, please fill up the Google form that we'll be sharing in the comment section right now, and you'll be receiving that, inshallah. All right. So with that, inshallah, I think we can move on to the question and answer session. All right. So the first question is, how do we answer atheist academics like Dr. Edward Tabash, who posed the question that if God exists and is all-wise in the Islamic paradigm, why did God not choose a better or easier form of connecting to the creations compared to a revelation that was in a language only to a specific group of people, the Arabs, that it was revealed in Arabic?
Yes,
only they could understand it.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, but I don't think it's a very powerful objection. The reason I'm saying that is because the message of Islam can be translated in any language. The basic message of Islam, that God exists and he's worthy of worship. He is the Lord of everything that exists. He has names and attributes that are perfect, that have no deficiency and flaw, and that he is the only deity worthy of worship. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the final prophet, and he showed us how to worship Allah. Simple. That could be explained in any language: sign language, Morse code, Japanese, Chinese, Cantonese, Mandarin, Turkish, Greek, Aboriginal languages, any language. So it's a bit of a false question. It's like saying, it's assuming that the only way we can access the essence of the Islamic tradition is through Arabic. That's not true at all. And in actual fact, reality is going against him, because what does reality say? People who are non-Arabs, who don't know Arabic, are becoming Muslim all the time. So that would be a very easy, quick answer to Mr. Tabash.
Jazakallah khairan for that answer. The next question is, what books can you recommend for a beginner student in this field in addition to your book?
You know what? One of the reasons I wrote the book is because there wasn't a Muslim in the English language that wrote a book on this topic. So that was one of the problems. So a beginning book. There is a really old book. It's not that old, but it's probably old for you guys. It's called Dialogue with an Atheist. From what I remember, that was a really good basic book articulating certain positions and arguments, and it was in the dialogue format with an atheist. That's the only one that really comes to mind in a powerful way. There was another book called Islam in Focus that has a chapter that mentions something about God's existence. What else in English? Oh, there is a really good booklet that you could download. It's called Making Sense of God. It's a very basic summary of my own book, actually, and I think a lot of it was used from my book. It's published by One Reason. If you go to onereason.org, you can find the text version and the PDF version of Making Sense of God. So if you start with that and then you continue, inshallah, you'll be in a good place. But I would also always argue or affirm that you need to sit with ulama who have studied Aqidah, and you could go for a basic Aqidah book and then develop further, because, my whole book really is just a contemporary version of, the classical traditional arguments. That's it, really. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. It's just our job as Muslims at each generation to contemporize the classical tradition. We're not changing anything. Those concepts have existed since the beginning. So if you're able to study a creedal book in a way that you can apply it in the modern world, that'll be far more powerful than reading any other book.
All right. Jazakallah khairan. The next question is, atheists say science tells us the universe existed millions of years before humans arrived. Considering the verse be and it is, why did God wait for so long?
See, sometimes when people ask a question, you have to ask, does not being able to answer this question undermine Islam? No. You have to understand questions that are nice to have and questions that are fundamental. This is a non-fundamental question. God decided for humans to come on this planet way after. So what? Or universe, or Allah decided from us, according to the scientific understanding at the moment, which is limited. The Earth came billions of years after, then human beings came. Why did Allah wait so long? Well, we don't know. Allah is infinitely wise and all-knowing. Allah knows and we don't. However, you also understand that there is an assumption in the question. The assumption in the question is that this whole universe is just for human beings. Well, no, because Allah talks about that everything worships Allah in some way. Everything submits to the will of Allah in some way. So the purpose of the universe to exist in that perspective is to submit to Allah. So a purpose was being fulfilled even though we didn't exist. We came billions of years after. So there is an assumption in the question that everything is just for us. That's not the case at all. At the end of the day, creation itself is a manifestation of Allah's names and attributes, and creation is, submits to Allah. Everything does sajda in its own way, right, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's fulfilling its purpose. So, why did Allah create human beings way after? It assumes that human beings are the most important thing, and it's not necessarily the case, because Allah's creation has a purpose. Everything has a wisdom and a purpose behind it. So for those first few billion years, creation was fulfilling its purpose, right? So that would be the easiest way of doing it. But to be honest, this question, even if you can't answer it, doesn't really undermine God's existence or the fact that he's worthy of worship. It's just, nice to have. We'll ask Allah in Jannah and we get an answer. And the reason I'm saying it in this way is because you have to understand that not every question is a fundamental question. Just because you can't answer all the questions, it doesn't mean you should give doubt in your faith. Because some questions are fundamental, some are non-fundamental. This one is non-fundamental.
All right. The next question is somewhat of a follow-up question to the previous one. So why did it take 6 days to set up everything in the universe, as the Quran states, be and it is, and it also states 6 days to set up? This requires more clarification.
Yeah. Well, there's no contradiction here. Allah saying be and it is, and the universe or creation being created in 6 phases. I mean, to say 6 days from a human point of view, you know, with the sun and the earth, doesn't really make sense in that context. And the best way to translate that is 6 phases. There is no contradiction when Allah is saying kun fayakun, be and it is, because the it is the phases, right? That's the how, that's the asbab, that's the physical manifestation of the it is. So Allah said be, and the way it came into being was through the phases. Why do you have to assume that it just came like that? There's no indication for that at all. This is just the physical manifestation of Allah's command. So Allah says kun fayakun. The kun is the phases in this context. There's no contradiction, logical contradiction in any shape or form. It's like, for example, say for example, I want to move. Okay, I want to turn on the light, right? And but the way I turn on the light is through a series of dominoes. I push the first domino, and all the dominoes fall, and it takes about 30 seconds to turn the light on, right? Because the last domino would hit the switch. Now, I made a decision. I'm going to turn on the light, and I click it, right? And I move the first domino. Now, I've willed it to happen. I said, I'm going to turn on the light, and I do the first action. But then it takes some time for the light to switch on. There is no contradiction with my will being instantaneous and the way my will has manifested itself eventually after 30 seconds through the dominoes for the light to turn on. Likewise, Allah willed the universe to come into existence, kun, and then fayakun. And then Allah basically willed, and then his will manifested itself through the 6 phases. So there's no contradiction in from that point of view. But also, Allah also can, because we know Allah is all powerful, instantaneously do creation as well. But that's in line with his will and his wisdom. At times it will be 6 phases, at other times it will be instantaneous. Allah knows best, and that's in line with Allah's wisdom and knowledge and power.
Jazakallah khairan. The next question is studying modern philosophy a must to refute these doubts, or can we hold upon our classical understanding when dealing with them? Is it even possible to merge both?
Yeah, I mean, look, the classical understanding uses a classical language. So can you use a classical language in the modern world dealing with people who don't have that language? No, because the key usuli principle of dawah is to speak in a language that people understand, right? If I start going to, some atheists and start saying, makhluk, muhdath, mumkin al-wujud, wajib al-wujud, he'll be like, what the hell's going on here, right? Our job is to contemporize. So we have to, understand their language. And sometimes that means understanding their background. It doesn't mean you have to immerse yourself in philosophy. Of course not. Just understand their language and their frame of reference. Understand the classical concepts properly. Learn to apply them in a contemporary way. As simple as that. Now, I'm a strong believer that if you learn the fundamentals properly, you don't really have to engage in philosophical discourse because, look, every human being has a fitrah. And in the fitrah, the innate disposition, it has primary knowledge that Allah exists and He's worthy of worship. But that fitrah gets clouded. Our job is to uncloud the fitrah. If you know these fundamental arguments or perspectives or ayat or signs well, and you just share it with people, it could be enough to awaken the fitrah. You don't have to go into crazy philosophy. In actual fact, I would not even advise that because, you don't create certainty by dealing with doubts. You create certainty by giving them certainty. So give people really good, powerful Quranic arguments for Allah's existence, for why Allah is worthy of worship. And then if the questions come, deal with the questions. Don't start firefighting. Give them a strong foundation. Share Islam through that strong foundation that Allah exists, He is one, and He is worthy of worship, right? So, and I would also argue that there is a limit on how much you can philosophize because it gets to a blameworthy level. to the point where you're splitting their philosophical hair and you're not getting anywhere. And that for me is an indication that that person doesn't need philosophy anymore, doesn't need arguments anymore. What that person needs is something else. Maybe connection with Allah, maybe reading the Quran, maybe revelation, maybe good behavior from the Muslims, akhlaq and adab, who knows? Because there's different ways to uncloud the fitrah. Because if someone is going on such a crazy level and splitting the philosophical hair, this is an indication for something else that's going on. It's not an intellectual issue, it's a psycho-spiritual issue. I'll give you an example. You know, there was an atheist Pakistani that came to one of my university lectures, and he basically said something like, oh, your argument for God's existence doesn't make sense because causality doesn't make sense outside of the universe. By the way, I've answered that objection in the book, yeah? And, you know, I was like, what do you mean by causality? Because I knew that this wasn't the reason, right? I said to him, what do you mean by causality? And because, you know, I've studied philosophy, he basically concluded that he doesn't know. Because in Western philosophy, they haven't ironed out what is the nature of the causal link, okay? And he was like, I don't know. And I was like, well, isn't it very interesting that you're using a keyword in a sentence to refute Allah, but you don't know the meaning of that keyword? I said, sit down, bro. So I tried to chill out with him, being nice with him, akhlaq, adab, being approachable. And he basically said to me, from what I remember, that he was brought up in a secular family. He didn't know how to connect with Allah. He didn't feel the connection. So his real issue was about connection. It had nothing to do with causality. So sometimes when you hear these questions that are splitting the philosophical hair, it means that there's something else going on. You really feel that that nuanced, high-level type of question is the reason why they're denying Allah? Really? Like, really? They have a fitrah, man. It's already inside them. We have to awaken that. And when they give you such questions, you know, be intellectually and spiritually mature. Understand that there might be something else going on. Okay?
Right, Jazakallah khairan. The next question is, how can one refute pantheism, the belief that everything is a manifestation of and encompasses God?
Say that again.
How can one refute pantheism, the belief that everything is a manifestation of and encompasses God?
The refutation of pantheism, that everything is a manifestation of God and is God. Okay, well, the easiest refutation is to refer to the argument from dependency. So one would then argue that if everything is God, then you're saying God is dependent, and that's not God anymore. That's the easiest way of dealing with pantheism in light of the lecture that we had today. So if you remember, I talked about the dependency argument. We defined the 4 definitions of dependency. If God is the universe as well and in the universe, then you're saying God is dependent. If God is dependent, then he needs an explanation. If God needs an explanation, then he's not God anymore. Simple as that.
Jazakallah khairan. The next question is belief in God supernatural? Because usually atheists use this to shift the burden of proof by saying that the burden of proof is on the supernatural claim and not on that which is observable.
Yeah, so what? That's a ridiculous point that they make. Say to them, look, supernatural is a loaded term. Say God's existence is truth. And for all truths, for many truths, you don't require empirical evidence. Even in science, in order to have scientific truths, you need other truths that you can't prove with observation. Because the scientific method to work requires philosophical assumptions. These assumptions you can't prove empirically, right? For example, you have to believe that nature is uniform in order for science to work. You can't prove empirically nature is uniform because you have to assume it first. For example, Professor Samir Okasha, he's a philosopher of science, he makes this interesting point. Now, for a well-confirmed scientific theory to work, you have to assume that nature is uniform because you're never going to observe all the observations required to make a 100% certain conclusion. For example, take the Darwinian model. scientists say the Darwinian mechanism explains biological change because it's a well-confirmed theory according to them. But have they observed all of biological change? No, they haven't even discovered like 90% of the ocean yet, right? Or 80% or something. So, but the reason they could say that the Darwinian mechanism explains all of biological change because it's a well-confirmed theory, and it's because they have the assumption, the philosophical assumption, which they can't prove, that nature is uniform. That therefore you could apply a well-confirmed theory that has been confirmed with limited observations to the entire set of phenomena and observations that they're trying to understand. So don't fall for the trap that all claims have to have empirical evidence. That's a ridiculous claim. It's insane, and it's self-defeating, because when you say all truth claims have to have empirical evidence, then does that include the statement that you've just made? So if you're saying all truth claims have to have empirical evidence, well, what about the claim that all truth claims have to have empirical evidence? Is there any empirical evidence for that truth claim? No. So it's self-defeating. You shot yourself in the foot, right? Also, I would say to them, what about the value of truth? You're obviously asking this question or arguing with me or going against God's existence because you value truth. Can you justify truth being valuable using empirical evidence? Where in the empirical world can you derive a value? You can't. This is outside of the empirical domain, because the empirical world, you can't derive value from empirical stuff. So you're saying your whole question and your argument with me assumes that you value truth. But that value that you hold that is driving your discussion, your perspective here, cannot be proven with your own perspective, which is everything has to be empirical. So I hope that helps.
All right. The next question is, how can we differentiate between having free will and the written qadr of Allah?
Yeah, so this is a good question. It's an unanswered question. So I remember when I said to you there are fundamental questions and questions that are nice to have. This is not really a fundamental question. We can affirm that everything is predetermined and everything is based on the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the same time, we can affirm that we have free will, even though it might be limited free will. There seems to be a philosophical contradiction between the two, and we can't really reconcile it. Big deal. This is beyond us, because this is based on Allah's majesty and ability and power and knowledge. We're not going to know the full vastness of his power and knowledge and ability, because by virtue of who Allah is, we're limited beings. Allah is not. Allah has maximally perfect names and attributes to the highest degree possible. We cannot even understand that. So could we ever access the totality of Allah's knowledge and wisdom? No, because we have limitations, cognitive limitations, physical limitations. So from that perspective, to even try and understand how to reconcile the qudra, the power, and the qadr, and the irada, and the will, and the predestination, and the divine decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with our limited free will, this is beyond us. It's one of those questions that frankly is beyond us, and it should never really trouble you, to be honest, because us not really answering this question properly is a sign of our humanity and a sign of our limitation. And also, you need to understand that Allah doesn't address this topic in a philosophical way. Why do we pose it as a philosophical question? When Allah talks about divine decree and predestination, he also does it from the point of view to elevate us and to empower us. Because what does the Quran and Sunnah say? The Quran and Sunnah say that if the whole world were to come to harm you, they would never be able to harm you unless it's the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if the whole world were to come to benefit you, they'll never benefit you unless it's the will of the will, it's in line with the will and power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This makes us realize that things within the universe do not have intrinsic power. It's all because of Allah. So connect to Him, and that will free you from the kind of so-called fear or the so-called perceived obstacles in the dunya. They don't have any intrinsic power. Allah has all the power and the ability. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no true power apart from the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the concept of qadr and qudra and irad and all of these things, should free us from the slavery to thinking that the physical world has intrinsic power. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know. So it's there to give us wings, not to enslave us to the material world. It's meant to give us wings so we fly. And that's why the Sahaba achieved so much, because they really were connected with the Tawheed of Allah. They knew that no one's going to stop them unless Allah wills it. No one's going to harm them unless Allah wills it. No one's going to benefit them unless Allah wills it. And it's all about Allah. So let's connect straight to Him. Forget these intermediary physical stuff that Allah uses to manifest His will and power. Go straight to Allah, you know? And that's the whole point. It's not meant to be a philosophical exercise. It's supposed to be an existential exercise where you transcend the limitations of this world, the perceived limitations of, you know, the physical world. And that's how the Sahaba succeeded, you know. They were like an equivalent of a bunch of villagers with some sticks and one man and one book, and then they took over the whole of Europe, right? That's the equivalent. And for them to achieve that, they had to be connected to Allah. They didn't fear creation and believe that creation had intrinsic power. No, it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it was, and any harm or any benefit only came from Allah. And that freed them. Because when they dealt with obstacles, they knew that was just a manifestation of Allah's will. It wasn't going to be the source of benefit, and it wasn't going to be the source of any harm. So that made them fearless.
Jazakallah khair. The next question is, why do some philosophers of religion accept religious pluralism as religion plurality, whilst some go beyond its actual definition?
Are basically saying that they are like perennialists, or they believe that you know, all religions are the path to God, or the path to truth, and you could all have salvation with the different religions. Now, I think one of the main reasons that they articulate this case is because they probably haven't studied the Quranic revelation, for example. So if one believes that the Quran is from Allah, and they know it's from Allah, and they could prove it's from the divine, then it is very clear, according to the classical tradition, that there's only one way to God, which is through affirming the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worshipping Him, and affirming the finality of the prophethood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, does this mean that we didn't believe in other traditions? Does it mean that we have a monopoly on the truth? No, we believe the truths before, like the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Abrahamic traditions, but those truths were distorted over time. So we do believe that there is a monotheistic family, and there's been, like, you know, thousands and thousands of prophets that came to reveal this timeless truth to humanity. But we have the final revelation with the final prophet, and this is the final truth. And if someone studies the Quran with an open heart and mind, and they have access to the evidence why the Quran is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it'll be very hard to say that, you know, anything other than Islam leads to salvation. That wouldn't be true at all. The only thing that leads to salvation is La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah. There is no deity worthy of worship except Allah, and Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is final messenger.
Jazakallah khair. The next question is, what's a simple way to argue against the concept of evolution?
I don't think you should argue at all. Why do you feel that you need to argue against it? Look, currently, according to the majority of the scientists, the vast majority of scientists, they believe the Darwinian mechanism is the best explanation for biological change. Why do you want to argue that? The minute you want to argue that is when you believe that the Darwinian mechanism is a truth, just like a religious truth or the truth from Allah. No, scientific truths are true with a small t, not a big T. If you study the philosophy of science, you know that you can always have a future observation that can change your current conclusions. Even Richard Dawkins, who is evangelical concerning the Darwinian mechanism, the Darwinian evolution, he even says in his book, A Devil's Chaplain, I believe it's in A Devil's Chaplain, he says, in the future, we may have evidence that not only changes Darwinism, but maybe it will make us reject it altogether. Because that is one of the beauties of science. It's human knowledge. We don't have all the knowledge. And the more we progress, the more we change our theories, even if we believe them to be so true and well confirmed, they may change still in the future. So the nature of these type of scientific conclusions, although they're true from a scientific point of view, they're not true with a capital T, which means that there could be another observation that can contradict our current conclusions. Simple as that. So why do you want to argue that? The only reason you want to argue that is because we don't really understand what the nature of science is and the philosophy of science. That's what's created the problem. Because we've made science equal to divine revelation. But most philosophers of science, most scientists would say, take a chill pill, man. Science, don't evangelize science. Science is good, it works, it's great. Islam tells us to do science. But some of our conclusions are not going to be in line with the revelation. Big deal. Because we know in the future it might change based on new observations. So my advice to Muslims is do the science. If any scientific conclusions and theories contradict Islam, obviously do not take those theories into your aqidah, into your creed, because divine revelation has a higher epistemic value. It's absolutely true because it's come from the one who's all-knowing, all-wise. Science, even though we have well-confirmed theories, still can change, and the history of science is testimony to that. And if there happens to be a scientific theory that contradicts Islam, don't accept the theory in your aqidah, into your theological creed, but just accept it practically. So you don't accept it as a truth, accept it practically. It's working. We're going to work it out, and we see what happens. And I know it probably could change in the future based on your observations, because we know future observations or understanding can contradict our current conclusions. And just because something works, it doesn't mean it's absolutely true, because we know in the history of science that when things were working, we've later found out that they weren't true. For example, in the 1700s, there was this theory called the theory of phlogiston. The theory of phlogiston was that if you burnt combustible objects, they would release something called phlogisticated air. Dan Rutherford in 1772 or 1773, he used this workable theory and he discovered the truth of nitrogen. But later in the future, they found out that phlogiston as a theory was false, even though it was working. So just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. So my argument is take a chill pill. Don't worry about it. You don't have to review anything. Let the scientists do the scientific work. And anything that contradicts Islam, obviously don't take into your aqidah, because we have another source of knowledge, the Quran and Sunnah, which is, from a creedal point of view, is absolute. Anything that contradicts it, don't put it into your aqidah, but just work with it practically, knowing that this is human knowledge. We have the pixel, Allah has the picture, and in the future, things can change. And that's the beauty and nature of science. So it's not a problem. Don't worry about it.
The next question is going to be the last question. As we're running out of time. So the next question is, what's your take on the work of Imams Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah in refuting philosophers? What are similarities or differences in their approach, and how relevant are their works in today's challenges?
Oh my God, what a big... I can't answer that question right now. All I could say is that Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, Allah have mercy on them both, were absolute giants in Islam. They must be respected and loved very dearly. For example, I reference Ibn Taymiyyah around 10 times in my book, and I reference Al-Ghazali around 11 times in my book. And they both have a hell of a lot to say concerning our contemporary times. Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, he has a really robust response to the problem of evil and suffering, which is based on the kind of wisdom argument, and it's a really good response. Al-Ghazali, for example, has a great perspective on God's existence, on showing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, on the absurdity of the infinite regress of causes, which is something that Ibn Taymiyyah agreed with as well. And Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Ghazali also agreed in this world, this universe being the best possible world, right? So there were agreements, but there were also disagreements for sure. But what we have to understand is that they have a lot to say concerning the contemporary issues that we face. I would say that Al-Ghazali, specifically his life, resonates a hell of a lot with a lot of youth and a lot of people studying Western literature or studying in this kind of globalized world, because Al-Ghazali's life was just like Ibn Taymiyyah's as well, but specifically Al-Ghazali's life was filled with, you know, an intellectual and spiritual struggle, which for me is just phenomenal. Because Al-Ghazali, for instance, you know, he was the Don of Baghdad, and, you know, his students were scholars, and he couldn't speak one day. And you know the whole story, he went on this journey for 10 years or so, left his family, and he tried to humble himself. And, you know, that's where he wrote the Ihya, his massive piece of work. And what Al-Ghazali did was he showed to us that Iman doesn't come through philosophical arguments, although he was the one who wrote Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. He knew philosophy very well, and he told people, look, if you think that your Iman is going to be established through abstract rational proofs, he said someone smarter than you is going to come and basically refute you, just tweak a bit of your premises. He said Iman doesn't come through that. You know, from that perspective, Iman is a gift. Iman is through internalizing the Quran and Sunnah, living the Sunnah in your life, worshipping Allah, connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Al-Ghazali lived through that process. And it says a lot for us in a contemporary sense, is because a lot of us, you know, we come to the deen pretending to be intellectuals and having intellectual arguments, but really at the end of the day, Iman is going to first and foremost come through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his will and his mercy, and it's a gift. But we see it increasing through following Allah and his messenger, worshipping Allah, coming close to him, affirming Allah's names and attributes, understanding that he is the only one worthy of worship, engaging in that path of worship, following the Sunnah. And that's how, you know, you're going to internalize the tradition. And that's why Al-Ghazali was, you know, later on, he moved from being a philosopher to an existentialist, really. You know, what does it mean for you? How does it change your state of being? How you relate to yourself, how you relate to others, and how you relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you know, the way you engage with the tradition by internalizing the commands of Allah and the commands of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this would increase your iman and give you that conviction. Because conviction is not an algorithm, brothers and sisters. It's not saying that you just, you know, it's not a mathematical formula. You know, it's not that, unfortunately. I just want to wake you up to that. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. You know, iman is, and conviction and yaqeen is a gift from Allah. It's in the heart. And remember, the aql, the intellect, is a function of the heart, according to ulama. So you may know all the best arguments in the world, but you may have no iman. You know, you may not be guided. And, you know, and this is from Allah. So Al-Ghazali wanted you to focus on your heart. And so did Ibn Taymiyyah, because Ibn Taymiyyah had this focus on the fitrah. And Al-Ghazali had as well, but I think Ibn Taymiyyah focused on it more. And the fitrah is something that, you know, everyone has. Atheist, Muslim, Christian, Jew, pagan. Everyone has a fitrah, a natural disposition. And in that natural disposition is that Allah exists and is worthy of worship, but it gets clouded. And we just have to live a life and embark on a journey where our fitrah becomes unclouded to awaken the truth within. So anyway, so Al-Ghazali's life is an ayah, to be honest, in my view. It's, if you really read about his life and his journey, it's just phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. The way he moved from, like, you know, abstract philosophizing and theology to really getting you to understand that this is just a necessary evil. Like, he called this type of ilm al-kalam, in essence, from what I understand, he called it like a necessary evil. It's a medicine, rather. Now, it's a medicine for sick people. You don't give it to people who are already okay. So people who got fitrah, they're Muslim, they don't need this stuff. You don't want to confuse them. But people who are sick, then give it to them. That's how he described these type of arguments. It's for sick people. It's not for healthy people. So don't give medicine to healthy people. They'll become sick, right? And that's why I wanted to focus on the foundational stuff. And once you get the foundational stuff, everything else becomes much easier based on the usuli principle that doubt doesn't override certainty. But anyway, from that point of view, brothers and sisters, you know, to talk about, look, does it mean I agree with everything that Ibn Taymiyyah said and everything Al-Ghazali said? Of course not. That would be intellectually dishonest to say. But do I love them both dearly? Absolutely. I think once I wrote a poem how, you know, we need them back. We need the likes of Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah back, you know. And inshallah they'll come back in manifested in you know, in someone else. In some cases, you know, they could continue that legacy of contemporizing the rich tradition that we have. But yeah, there's a hell of a lot of respect and endearment and love for Al-Ghazali and for Ibn Taymiyyah. For me, Ibn Taymiyyah concerning the fitrah and how to awaken the fitrah, and also the way he approached the problem of evil, also, yeah, those kind of areas. For Al-Ghazali, it would be some elements of God's existence, his journey, his, you know, his perspective on what Iman is and Yaqeen is from the perspective of how do you develop it. You're not going to develop it through abstract rational arguments. You have to live the Quran, you have to live the Sunnah, that kind of existential approach. Al-Ghazali's ability just to rip someone apart and deconstruct them and just make them realize, you know, where is your intention? You know, you should read the book Deliverance from Error, I think it's called, or even the book Oh My Disciple, Oh My Son. That's very powerful. Some very powerful questions in there. And Ibn Taymiyyah was similar as well. So, I mean, yeah, you know, I love them both, respect them both. And that's what our teachers teach us, to love and respect our ulama, even if you disagreed with them on some issues. Like, you know, there's some issues that I disagree with Ibn Taymiyyah just based on my own learning. And there's some issues I may disagree with Al-Ghazali. But that's life. No one agreed with each other on everything. Yeah, even the ulama had these debates. But and I say this not in an arrogant way. I say this as just a very humble student of a student of knowledge. So I'm not even second class. I'm third class. Yeah, and I say this with huge humility that we stand on their shoulders. And I always say this: we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we love them and respect them, and they have a lot to offer in the contemporary sense. So, but the question is so big, it would take so long to unpack. Maybe for another time. May Allah bless you guys.
Jazakallah khairan for the detailed answer. So with that, we've come to the end of our event. Alhamdulillah. I would just like to remind all of you once again, for you to receive your free copy of Ustad Hamza's book, The Divine Reality. Please fill up the form that we've shared, the link of which we have shared in the comments below. So yeah, Jazakallah khairan, Ustad Hamza, for enlightening us with your knowledge, taking time out of your busy schedule for us. And Jazakallah khairan to all the attendees for taking the time out to listen to our event. And we hope you benefited from it immensely. And please keep us in your du'as. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.